Bootloaders bridge the gap between the firmware and the full Linux kernel. There are three main bootloaders used by default in Linux, and they are Lilo, our Linux loader, GRUB, which is Grand Unified Bootloader Legacy, and GRUB2. Originally, the Lilo, our Linux loader, was the only bootloader available. While it accomplished its purpose, it was extremely limited in what it could do. The Lilo configuration file was stored in a single file located at /etc/lilo.conf, which defines the systems to boot. Lilo is hard to find today because it doesn't work with UEFI systems. The first version of GRUB, now called GRUB Legacy, was created in 1999. Because of its configurability, it quickly became the default bootloader, regardless of if the system ran on BIOS or UEFI. In 2005, GRUB2 was created as a total rewrite of the GRUB Legacy. GRUB2 supports advanced features such as the ability to load hardware drivers using logic statements to dynamically alter the boot menu options, depending on the conditions detected on the system. GRUB Legacy allowed you to select multiple kernels and/or systems using both a menu interface and an interactive shell. You configured the menu interface to provide options for each kernel or operating system. The interactive shell allows you to customize boot commands on the fly. Configuring the interactive menu, you need to tell it what options to show using special GRUB menu commands. GRUB Legacy stores these in a standard text configuration file called menu.list, usually located at the /boot/grub folder. Some distributions use grub.config instead of .list for the configuration file. The GRUB Legacy configuration file consists of two sections: global definition and operating system boot definitions. Global definitions define commands that control the overall operation of the GRUB Legacy boot menu. They must appear first in the configuration file. The global settings that you can make are listed to the right here. To define a value for a command, you list the value as a command line parameter. For example, you set default to 0, timeout to 10, color white, blue, yellow, blue. Color is for this color scheme for the menu. The first argument defines the foreground background for the normal menu entry, while the second defines the foreground background for the selected menu entry. After setting the global definitions, you place definitions for the individual operating systems. Each should have its own definition section. There are a lot of boot settings that you can use to customize how the bootloader finds the kernel file. Only a few are required to define the operating system. Ones worth remembering are the title, the first line for each boot definition. This is what appears in the boot menu. The root defines the disk and partition where the grub/boot folder partitions is on the system. Kernel defines the kernel image file stored in the /boot folder to load. initrd defines the initial RAM disk file, which contains drivers necessary for the kernel to interact with the system hardware. And the root no verified defines non-Linux boot partitions such as Windows. The root command defines the hard drive and partition that contains the /boot folder for GRUB Legacy. GRUB Legacy references those values, such as hard drive, partition. GRUB Legacy uses a number system to reference disk and partition, starting with a 0 instead of a 1. The reference to the first partition on the first hard drive on the system would be HD0,0, and the second partition on the first hard drive would be HD0,1, for example. The initrd command helps solve a problem that occurs when using specialized hardware or file systems, as the root drive. The initrd command defines a file that's mounted by the kernel at boot time as a RAM disk, also called the initrd. Then the kernel can load modules from the initrd RAM disk. This allows it to access hardware or file systems not compiled into the kernel itself. The initrd RAM disk file is located at the /boot folder and is called initrd.img- in the kernel version. If you have new hardware that's required to be visible at boot, you will need to modify the initrd file. You can create a new initrd RAM disk image containing modules for the new hardware using the make init ramfs. This example shows two boot options, one for Ubuntu and one for Windows. Linux is on the second hard drive, the first partition, and Windows is on the first hard drive, the first partition. If you notice, the Ubuntu kernel file name is vmlinuz. The C at the end indicates the file is compressed. For non-compressed kernel images files, it will usually be called vmlinux instead of C. Now that you have built the GRUB Legacy configuration file, you have to install the GRUB Legacy program into the master boot record. The grub install command will do this. You just have to supply the partition on which to install it. You can do this in two ways, using the Linux format, which is grub-install /dev/sta, which is the partition you want to install it in, to install GRUB on the master boot record on the first hard drive. Or you can do GRUB Legacy format, which encloses the hard drive format in quotes, So it'd be grub-install quote HD0 first hard drive. If you're using the chain loading method and prefer to install a copy of GRUB Legacy on the boot sector of a partition instead of on the master boot record, you must specify the partition. Again, either Linux or GRUB format. There's no need to reinstall GRUB Legacy in the master boot record after changing the configuration file because GRUB Legacy reads the configuration file each time it runs. So now I'm going to bring up an example of the GRUB menu on a Ubuntu server. With Ubuntu, you have to hold a shift key in order to view this menu. But you can use the arrow keys to go up and select which operating system you're loading. This just has Ubuntu, the one kernel. You can click E to edit the commands in here. So let's say we're going to edit Ubuntu. And you can go down here and edit the code any way you want to. And then after you finish editing, you can press Ctrl X or F10 to boot with the changes you made. Or you can hit Escape to discard those changes or return to this menu. You can hit the E key to go to the command line, and once you're at the command line, and Escape exits you from this at any time. Okay, review question time. Which was the first bootloader program used in Linux? Was it GRUB Legacy, Lilo, GRUB2, SysLinux, or IsoLinux? And the answer is Lilo. Question 2. What are the GRUB Legacy configuration files stored? /boot/grub, /boot/fe, /etc, /var, or /proc. And the answer is GRUB Legacy configuration files are stored in the /boot/grub. Thank you everybody, I'll see you again next time.